Do you still remember that Windows 98 retro gaming PC I built a while ago? Well, in the meantime, I rearranged some components here and there. Furthermore, instead of Windows 98, I decided to go with the far more stable and more familiar Windows XP to me. Additionally, I've also gone with an awesome hardware upgrade. Unfortunately though, I have failed embarrassingly, and yes, I am publicly admitting my fail. I have no problem with that. What doesn't kill you only makes you stronger. Now, I'm not going to tell you just yet what exactly went wrong, since I myself only had to realize my epic fail in the final stages of this upgrade project, so I couldn't cancel abort this video project in time. So what I've planned for you is to go through the same chronological order I went through during this upgrade process. All I can say is, it's me who's to blame, and once I've come to the realization as to what I've messed up, I was simply baffled. Alright, enough talking, let's get straight into this slightly unusual adventure of mine. First of all, what did I actually plan on achieving with that upgrade I'm talking about? What did I end up disliking about that Windows 98 system I previously built? All in all, I was content, but Windows 98 really isn't the most stable operating system out there by any means, and it does come with some limitations. Not necessarily each and every game title is and was able to run smoothly with Windows 98, which kinda makes sense since I've had the privilege of growing up with what may be one of the most legendary operating systems ever, Windows XP. As great and awesome a pair of those 3DFX Voodoo 2 3D accelerator cards may have been in their respective era, they no longer deliver the best performance in games I want to play, especially given most games in my collection primarily run with DirectX, higher versions of which aren't really supported by the slower Voodoo 2 or even Voodoo 3 cards. To make matters worse, the max resolution is limited to 1024 by 768, a noticeable difference to what I want, 1280 by 1024. Aside from that, it can be incredibly difficult getting any Voodoo 2 drivers working properly under Windows XP. So it only makes sense to ditch those two 3D accelerators in my case. Those cards now are relics of the past, buried deep underneath in a golden casket. No, I'm just kidding, they're resting in my studio, which at the same time also is what I consider my personal storage of goodies. So they are obviously not buried and there's also no golden casket. But let's get back to the point. Besides the fact those Voodoo 2 cards got removed from my system and I installed Windows XP with even more games to choose from, everything else more or less remains the same. So what I have running in here is an Intel Pentium 4 1.8 GHz CPU sporting 256 KB of level 2 cache and a 400 MHz frontside bus. The platform therefore is based on a socket 478. This is where my trusty ASUS P4S8X comes into play, a board that I picked up several years ago. 512 MB of DDR 400 MHz RAM, a generic CPU cooler, an 80 GB Seagate IDE/PATA hard drive with 7200 RPM, and to top things off, a rather powerful ATI Radeon 9600 Pro AGP graphics card of the AIB power color, equipped with 128 MB of video memory and support for DX9. Since my trust level for ancient old power supplies is very low, that modern Chieftronic PowerPlay Gold 550W PSU comes into play here, along with the Deepcool Matrix 73F case you used to see previously, with some of you not really ending up liking my choice of case for such a retro project, but hey, it's up to me to like it, first and foremost. Among my retro stuff I have lying around, in the meantime I discovered I still had a 256 MB DDR module, so part of today's upgrade also is the memory. I'll go from 512 MB to 768. Well, yeah, it's not the greatest leap, admittedly, but whatever, it's a few megabytes more to work with. Although it's fair to say this is a pretty suboptimal addition since I end up mixing DDR 400 with DDR 333. These 333 MHz will end up causing a bottleneck that I'm willing to accept in return for slightly more capacity to work with. I didn't really want to spend any money on a matching memory module for this cause. What bothered me most of all though is the CPU performance. With 1.8 GHz and a measly 256 KB of cache, I wasn't quite getting the performance I had hoped for in a couple of games. Even with a Radeon 9600 Pro, things aren't always running smoothly, with quite nasty hiccups from time to time. Very annoying FPS drops, in fact. Now, since I'm not swimming in CPUs, I went out of my way and paid €8, that are roughly $9 or $10, including shipping, to get a higher clocking Pentium 4 for my build. That one comes in at a whopping 2.8 GHz, is equipped with 512 KB of L2 cache, and features an FSB of 800 MHz. Before I dive into the whole upgrading process though, I first want to gather some before and after results in games in terms of FPS. Of course, not really any exact, super accurate measurements whatsoever, since things are a bit chaotic when I'm touching retro stuff anyway. Here and there, it's clearly visible the frame rate cannot be maintained at all times, and certainly is not the best result one can achieve to start with. In other games, however, sometimes the FPS turn out good, then there's a huge frame drop, then it goes back up, and so on and so forth. That's very annoying and far from a great experience. So I guess let the upgrading process begin. Phew, now that turned out to be a lot of effort. Really exhausting. It's rocket science after all. So let's power this thing on, and I'm expecting a nice 768 MB of RAM in theory, along with a juicy CPU speed of 2.8 GHz. Back in the day, the CPU speed played an even bigger role than it's the case today. But what's going on? 1866 MHz for the CPU frequency, and no option to manually crank it up to 2800 MHz? Guys, at this point, I knew I completely messed up. Obviously, this Pentium 4's frontside bus of 800 MHz is not supported by the motherboard. And before purchasing that processor, I thought I did my homework and did some research beforehand. I checked the CPU support list on the ASUS website for this board, but obviously it seems I mixed up one line with the other while being short on time at that given day of purchase. Not a single processor with an 800 MHz frontside bus is supported by this specific board. Only 400 and 533 MHz are fine, which can easily and very clearly be seen on this list by ASUS. The CPU multiplier, as usual for back in the day, was locked for the CPUs. There is a possibility though, and that would be cranking that clock speed up manually, overclocking basically. This, however, is not necessarily advisable with old PC components, but I wanted to give it a quick try anyway, but without actually touching the CPU voltage. Complete nonsense, I know. But now that I've gotten this far, why not actually check and see how the system behaves and reacts to that, and whether or not it would even boot up. That was not a problem, but that AGP slot, or rather graphics card, is going crazy and doesn't like what I'm putting it through. No sign of any stability. Makes sense, there's more than just a single reason for that. But even if the overclock were successful, I'd only get up to 2.32 GHz. That's far off from those 2.8 GHz the CPU actually is capable of. So there's nothing else left other than to acknowledge my super embarrassing fail. In hindsight, it's quite funny actually, I gotta admit. Next time around I'll pay a lot more attention. So yeah, the frequency therefore for now remains the same at 1.8 GHz. What I've gained today are an additional 256 MB of memory and 256 KB of level 2 cache. The only upgrade I've made when it comes to the CPU is doubling the amount of cache from 256 to 512 KB. Now, did all this work actually lead to any performance improvements in games? Long story short, not really. There are a few improvements noticeable, but I wouldn't really consider it a real upgrade as a matter of fact. Whether it's the additional cache or RAM that's to be thanked for a few % more performance, I'm not sure. I'd have to do separate testing to determine that. I would have loved to finally wrap this project up personally, but I guess you'll get to see a part 3 now sometime in the future. If I don't mess that up as well, it will hopefully be the final part of this build. So for now, take care everyone, and before buying anything, please pay close attention. You see what can happen if you do shopping in a rush. Thanks for watching everyone.